Hello trumpet players. In this video we're going to be talking about a part of my practice and teaching technique that I call the lit rotation, and for the kids I call it camping songs. This is video number 1 of 3. Camping songs, or the lit rotation. In the first video we're going to talk about how I came to develop this system, and it is a system, it's a small system, part of the bigger system. This is part of, when I talk about the accumulative approach to practicing, this is part of that art of accumulative practicing. It's one of many parts. The basic idea is the same for all the parts, but it's applied differently. Anyway, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about a rotation system for the songs that you already know. But for that to make sense, let's take a step back and talk about the history. This goes back to the 80s when I was asked to do a recital. Now by that time I had already been playing for 15 years, and just like most people, I learned a new solo at least once per year. And so I had at least a dozen solos under my belt at that time. Why did I freak out? Okay, so the recital was like this. I'm walking down the hall and the head of the music department says, "Hey Eddie, this person bailed out on us for this Sunday. Can you come and do a recital instead?" And I said, "Yes, I'll do it." But after I said yes, I freaked out. Why did I freak out? Because my life up to that point was I would practice a solo, move on. Practice the next solo, move on. Practice the next solo, move on. I had nothing at that point in my career except maybe the last solo that I learned, which at that time I think was the Hindemith. And I knew this was not right. I knew that things should not be that way. And so the beginning of this story is that I felt stupid. I felt like I had really screwed up. Here I had invested all that time, all that effort into all those solos for nothing. So now we move on, we move into the 90s. And so I got out of school, I think 1991, around there, maybe 92. And my thought was, all my life, stuff has been getting, mostly school stuff, has been getting in the way of me practicing as much as I knew I needed to practice. So for the first time in my life, I had, quote unquote, enough time to practice. Or so I thought. This was an exciting time for me. I was very dedicated to getting everything that I knew that was supposed to be done every day. Up until this point in my life, it was not possible. It was not possible to do everything that was required every day. Okay? And I blamed school for that. So when school got out, when I was done with university, I thought, great, this is my chance. And I tackled it. I tackled it big time. And it didn't take me long to figure out that 24 hours a day is not long enough. No matter how much I shifted my schedule. No matter how much time I practiced for the day, I was back in those days, I was practicing as much as 8 hours per day. I'm going to say that again. Back in those days, I was practicing as much as 8 hours of practice time on my face. Some people think that when you sit down to play piano, that's your practice time on the horn. No. I'm talking about 8 hours, with the exception of the rest and play stuff, right? So I do believe in resting as long as you play. So when you play the phrase that lasts 8 measures, you rest 8 measures and then you play. So I don't count that as, I do count that as part of the 8 hours. But my point is 8 hours of practice time on the face, back and forth like that. 8 hours is not enough time to cover everything you're supposed to cover in one day. And you know, the thing is, most people say you shouldn't practice more than 2 or 4 hours a day. How do they get all of that done? My suspicion is they don't. That's part of what I figured out in those days, is all these people that say you should do this every day. Probably they don't. Because I actually put all that stuff into action. You can't. This guy says this every day, that guy says that every day. You know, if you took all those people that say you should do this every day and do all of it every day, 8 hours is not long enough. So I came up with this great idea. This is the beginning of my accumulative method. It's also the beginning of this rotation cycle thing that we're talking about. I thought, what would happen if 24 hours a day is not enough? What would happen if I made my practice day 36 hours long? How does that work? I'm not talking about staying up for 36 hours. I'm talking about the practice day. So I would practice 1 day's worth of practice on Monday, and then half of, up to noon, maybe later than noon, maybe 3 o'clock, finish up Monday's practice. And after 3 o'clock, warm up and start Tuesday's practice, which would now take all of Wednesday. Then the third day, the Wednesday practice, would actually start on Thursday. This was a great idea. It's one of those think outside of the box type of things. Didn't work. That's the problem. Even a 36-hour practice day is not enough to get, quote unquote, everything done. So what is the next step? I tried 48 hours. And you know what? I have proof of this. There are some people that were hanging out with me during those days who I told this to, and I remember getting an email one time, and the guy says, you know, that my outside of the box thinking, saying my work day is now 2 days long, was an inspiration for him, right? So yes, this is not just like something that I imagined. I was actually talking to people about this. So next step, 48-hour days. What happened with that? Was it long enough to get everything you're supposed to do in a single day of practice? The answer is no, it wasn't. Even at 48 hours, even at doubling the amount of practice time that could possibly fit into a single day, I could not get everything done that was supposed to be done. So once again, the wheels in my mind start turning, and I start trying to figure this out. Yeah, I did not go to a 3-day work day because that's not a thing. I know that a 2-day work day is not a thing, but at least that was conceivable. But if you're doing a 3-day work day, you're really doing a work week. And if you're really doing a work week, then this whole thing doesn't fly. This whole idea of you need to do this every day actually really means you need to do this regularly. The everyday thing doesn't fly. But if you're going to do it regularly, you need to be organized about it. Anyway, so what I ended up doing out of my frustration, and I'm gonna recap some of this real quick so that you get the whole picture. I'm out of school, I have all the time in the world to practice, and I discover that even 16 hours of practice doesn't get you through a full day's worth of practice. That's when I started what today I call the art of accumulative practice. And it comes out of that frustration. I know there's things that we have to do regularly, not daily. Daily's not possible. There are certain things we need to do regularly. But it's not possible to do them in a day. It's not possible to do them in 2 days. It's probably not possible to do them in 3. So you have to break out of that daily trap. You have to actually break out of that and stop thinking that way. Now, I'm going to put as a caveat right there, this breaking out of the daily thing only works if you can be organized with your practice. And we're going to get more into that in the future, not in the near future. It's going to be the distant future. I'll just let your mind chew on it for now. This accumulative style of practicing does not work if you're storing everything in your head. It's impossible. There's so many things that we're supposed to practice regularly. It's impossible to keep track of all of it in your head. Okay? So yes, this is where the accumulative stuff comes from. Now we go on to the third part of my story. Now I was already starting to do, as part of the accumulative approach, rotations with my scales. I was already starting to do rotations with certain kinds of exercises. I was already starting to do that kind of stuff. Now we're talking about a trip I took with David Caceres, and I might have talked about this before. David Caceres is by far the best jazz musician I've ever worked with, and I was in his band for 20 years, just short of 20 years. My greatest growth spurt as a jazz trumpet player, was during the time I was in his band. Okay, now we had this one gig in San Antonio with him, and he was going to fly. I think he had a jazz festival performance in Norway, I think, back in those days. And he was going to fly to there straight from our gig in San Antonio, and he asked me if I would ride with him and drive his car back. And on the way, I got to pick his brains about how did he become such a great jazz player. And I thought, because I'm the kind of guy that studies this and studies that. I have every book you can think of. Well, every book you could think of in the 90s, up to the 90s. And I said, well, what books did you work out of? And his response to the book thing was surprising to me. So he did mention a book, and I got that book and I delved into it. But he wasn't actually that excited about that book either. And when I dig deeper into this, I find out that what he attributes to his success as a jazz player had less to do with the lessons that he's taken, the books that he's written, books that he's read and practiced out of. Has less to do with that. He basically attributed his skill as a jazz player to the fact that he's played so many gigs. He's been gigging, you know, I don't know anyone else in my life that has played as many gigs as he has. Really. And they're mostly jazz gigs. Other stuff too, but mostly jazz gigs. Well, that makes sense. You guys have heard me say before that some of the most valuable teaching experience that you'll ever have in terms of being taught, some of the most valuable experience you'll ever have is sitting next to someone that plays. The gigs are the greatest education, and you can't buy that. Well, I guess you can buy that. It just dawned on me. If you've got a lot of money and you want to hire a bunch of people to play with you, you can buy that. So I've actually heard of that before. But you get my drift. And I'm driving his car back to Houston thinking, but I'm a trumpet player. I can't get 12 gigs a week. Actually, there was a time when I was working that much, but it wasn't jazz stuff. Yeah, the most I ever had in 1 week was 12 jobs, and I was able to maintain that, I think about 5 or 6 years. Not 12 gigs every week, but that rate of playing gigs. They call us gig rats back in those days, people that take every gig that comes up. And yes, when I was living that way, I had a lot of gigs, but it wasn't the same kind of gig. I was playing mostly salsa, I was playing horn section stuff, I was playing classical stuff. It wasn't stuff that I could jam on. There was maybe a little bit of jamming, like 2 solos a night or something like that. So I'm asking myself, how can I apply what I learned from David to my own practice life, my own music life? And I decided at that moment, and what we're talking about now is the literature rotation, I decided that from now on, I was going to have mock performances at my home. I'm going to start, and I had different days back in those days. I had the classical mock performance and the jazz mock performance. And if there was any day that I didn't have a gig, I would, the very last thing I would practice, I didn't even consider it part of my practice time back then. It was a gig. But I had control over what music I was going to play. I treated it like a mock performance. If it was a jazz thing, I would put Band in the Box on and jam along with the Band in the Box. And the nice thing about that, right, is you can play as many choruses as you want. So I think my jazz rotation, I would do 5. Back in those days, I don't do it like this now. Back in those days, I was doing 5 tunes a night. And I was doing, I think I set the Band in the Box to 11 choruses. So we're talking, depending on what songs I was playing, we're talking this was anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half mock performance, depending on what the songs were. I'm kind of guessing that. I back in those days, I didn't measure my time, how long I was practicing when I was doing that stuff. I was measuring the other stuff, but when it was a mock performance, I would just go. Same thing with the classical stuff. It didn't take as much time. So I took all the classical pieces that I knew. Now you see how this is connected to that recital that I was going to play. Oh, by the way, I didn't tell you in the video yet. That recital got canceled. Whew. off the hook, right? But yes, it got canceled, and I didn't have to do it. But I asked myself coming out of that, why am I not? I've been doing solos my whole life. I should be able to just say, okay, yeah, I'll do a recital on Sunday. I'm ready to go. Let's do it. And it's the same thing with the jazz stuff, right? Now, the difference between the classical stuff for me and the jazz stuff, my set list of songs on the jazz side was over 300 songs. On the classical side, I had, I think, 30, maybe 40 classical pieces that I had. And those were all memorized. I kind of let that go, and I would like to revisit it someday, but yes, I kind of let that go, the classical rotation. Um, Mainly because all those years of doing that rotation, I've not really had. I think I've played two or three recitals that whole time. Um, so yes, it's I have at this point in my career, I have to look at the financial viability of the time I spend, and there's not a lot of reason for me to be spending that time. Now on the jazz side, the number of songs is still growing. I'm I don't know where I'm at now. It's more than 300 plus, right? Um, Now if I just do a song a day, it will take a whole year to get back around to the songs that I started, right? But that's the idea, is to keep. When I first started this, it was on that lower level that I was thinking. I want to always be ready. And that was the benefit I had in my mind at that point. Let's always stay ready. When they call you, you can go, you're ready to go. Since then, I've learned that there's a much more significant benefit to approaching the songs this way. And this is where that underlying concept of the accumulative approach. What are you accumulating in the art of accumulative practice? What are you accumulating? You're accumulating familiarity. I like to tell this story about this, and I don't know who it was, because it was so long ago. It was in the early 90s. A friend of mine had a office. I think he was on the TCU campus. No, not TCU, TSU. I'm sorry, Texas Southern University. Um, and he had an office there. He's a lawyer, and he would have a jam session in the foyer of his office. And I went there one time, and this gentleman, really really old trumpet player, and he didn't have the chops, right? He didn't play loud, he didn't play high, but when he played the tunes, there was something in his playing that I didn't have. And if I have to put a label on that thing, I would call that thing familiarity. Here you're talking about, I don't remember his exact age. I'm going to say it was around 90 years old. And I assume he was playing since he was 10, 15 years old, around there. So we're talking about someone who was probably, the songs he played that night, he was probably playing now those songs for 70, 80 years. That kind of familiarity far, far supersedes how much technique you have, how high you can play, how loud you can play, how exciting you are. You listen to someone who's been playing that long and doing it well. that's going to touch your heart. That's going to do something to you emotionally, spiritually. And that's part of the influence that I had. I want to be that guy. I want to be, you pick a tune. I've been playing that tune since 1980. Since, not I played it in 1980, let me try it again now. No, it keeps coming up in my rotation. Now, there are some songs that are like that, that are not in my rotation. I'll be on a gig and they'll pull up a song and I'll say, man, I haven't played that since the 80s, right? And my first thought is that needs to go into my rotation. Now, at this point, if you're not my student, you don't know what I'm talking about, this rotation. The next two videos are going to talk about the rotation itself. This video is just to give you the backstory about how I got there. Now, I know I'm jumping around a little bit. Let me clarify one more time. The purpose of these lists, these rotation lists, was originally to always be familiar. But there's this other thing that happens when you have long-term familiarity, where you learn the song, you got away from the song, you came back to the song, you got away from the song, you came back to the song a little later again, you get away from the song, and the time that stretches between when you learned it, the last time you played it, and now when you're doing it again, it gets longer and longer and longer, and you're pulling it from farther and farther back in your mind. There is something almost magical that happens when you do that. And you can almost create, those guys that practically live on the road, music is their life, so to speak, right? You can practically create that for yourself by doing this rotation, by constantly doing this rolling performance of all your songs. Now, the story doesn't end there. One of the most difficult things for me to teach has been this rotation, because it's when you have more than 30 songs, it gets a little bit complicated. You don't just throw the new song into a batch of 300. It's going to take you months to get back to that song again. You're not ready for that. So I had to come up with a system, and then I had to start teaching that system to the students, which was not always that easy. So that's the end of the story, is I do believe I've found a way to do this, to teach it to the students. By the way, this video is the answer to a request from one of my students. He lives up in Canada. His name is Marcel. And I told him, I promised him I would make a video about the rotation so that it would be a little bit easier. Now, we haven't got to the part that I promised to him, but I do believe this backstory is important, so you understand why are we doing this, where does it come from, and the next two videos are how does it work. Okay? Anyway, if you have questions about this part of it, the backstory, please feel free to ask below. You can always join us at the Q&A. We try to do those on Fridays, but just keep an eye open for the Q&A. It's a live stream trumpet Q&A where I answer your questions. I answer your questions. I'm not an authority on other people's methods. I'm an authority on my method. So your questions should be either general music stuff, general trumpet stuff, or my method. Sometimes people try to ask me, hey, how about this guy's method. I'm like, that's that guy's method. Go ask him. So um, now sometimes people will ask me on the Q&A, how has that method influenced my method? Then that's fine. I don't mind talking about that. All right. So yes, please, any questions that you have, please ask below or in the Q&A. Other than that, God bless you, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you.